Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the first episode of our new webinar series called Connected Estuary. My name is Kristen Walters, and I'm a biologist and coordinator for our Lower Fraser Salmon Conservation Program. So first, before we get going, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. I live and I'm calling in from the town of Squamish in British Columbia, which is on the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation and people. I feel really grateful to live and work in such a beautiful place and want to acknowledge the Squamish people who have lived here since time immemorial. And for those of you who are new to our work, Raincoast Conservation Foundation is a nonprofit and team of conservationists and scientists who are empowered by our research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. So we use rigorous peer-reviewed science and community engagement to further our conservation objectives. And our Lower Fraser Salmon Conservation Program, which this webinar is a part of, is really focused on research and restoration in the Fraser River Estuary, as well as the Lower Fraser River. And it's focused on building a broader vision for salmon habitat conservation and restoration throughout the whole of the Lower Fraser. So our goal with this program is really to see healthy populations of wild salmon returning to the Lower Fraser River and landscape. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Fraser River, I'll provide a bit of a context for our work before we dive into the webinar. So the Fraser River is one of the world's greatest rivers. It's the largest on Canada's west coast and has a watershed that drains more than a quarter of BC. So historically, it was considered one of the greatest salmon producing rivers in the world. And the mouth of the river, the estuary, is equally as significant. And it's about 21,000 hectares, which makes it the largest estuary on the west coast of North America. So it's really big. And all of the salmon that spawn in the Fraser watershed use the Lower Fraser River and estuary as a migration corridor. And many of those populations also rely on the Lower Fraser River and estuary for both spawning and rearing. So this lower part of the river and the estuary are really the cornerstone for our work in the Lower Fraser Salmon Conservation Program at Raincoast. And so as part of this program, we initiated this new exciting webinar series, which has 6 parts, and it will explore what science can tell us about the history, vulnerability, and connectivity of the Fraser River Estuary. So this first episode that you're joining us for is called Connecting Past to Present. And we will explore the cultural and ecological importance of the estuary to the Indigenous Nations of the Lower Fraser River and estuary. And we will also discuss the extent of landscape change and habitat loss that has occurred in the last 150 years since contact, as well as the challenges facing the estuary today. So before I introduce our guests, it would be great for those of you tuning in to introduce yourselves and where you're calling in from in the chat box provided in either YouTube or Facebook. And since we can't meet in person, learning where you all are calling in from is the next best thing. And as just one quick housekeeping note, feel free throughout the episode to type any questions you have into the chat box. And we'll provide some time at the end of the episode for our guests to answer your questions. So with that, I would like to introduce our guests. Steve Stark is an executive counselor of the Tsawwassen Legislature, entrepreneur and CEO of Tsawwassen Shuttles Incorporated. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the webinar.
Great. Thank you for that quick introduction. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Raincoast for hosting this webinar and everybody for being here today. I also like to recognize the unceded territory of Tsawwassen First Nation, Samiamu, Kwantlam, and the other surrounding Coast Salish Indigenous communities. Yeah, she had touched on a few things that I do. I'm an executive council member at Tsawwassen First Nation. I'm also an active fisherman, crabber within our territory. I'm also a co-owner of different companies and also the president of a new cumulative effect group called SIGA as well. So we'll dive into that a little later. But yeah, just want to say thank you and how excited I am to be part of the first webinar for Raincoast Forest. So welcome everybody. I hope everybody enjoys the next hour that we have together here. So, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Our next guest is Riley Finn. Riley is a Raincoast Research Associate and Masters of Science candidate at the University of British Columbia with Dr. Tara Martin in the Conservation Decisions Lab. Hi, Riley.
Hi, Kristen. And yeah, thanks again for giving this space to share my work and to talk about this great place. I started kind of on this project back in 2017, working with Raincoast to try to bring together as much spatial information on salmon habitat in the Lower Fraser as possible. And from that, we kind of realized there's a lot of information on where physical barriers are limiting salmon movements. And so kind of the natural question out of that is to where to prioritize, how do we most effectively kind of start working towards removing those barriers? And so that's where the intersection with my supervisor, Tara Martin, who's an expert in decision science, came along. And so we've been trying to answer those two questions about how, our current information on barriers in the Lower Fraser can inform, the extent to which habitat has been alienated, and then also to identify, what are those priority barriers to restore. So yeah, thanks again, and looking forward to chatting more about this work.
Great. Thanks to you both for those in-depth introductions. I'm going to ask a few of you questions around your relationship with the estuary, as well as the work that you do. And so Steve, if it's okay, we'll start with you. I'm wondering if you could describe the relationship between the Tsawwassen Nation and people and the Fraser River Estuary, and if there's different aspects of this relationship, such as ecological and cultural values.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Good question. Tsawwassen First Nation and the Lower Fraser Estuary has a vital importance to our existence. We are known as the Salmon people, facing the sea. And, there's an old saying of when the tide is down, the table is set for this area, because there's so much resources available at the tip of our fingers. Our ancestors used to be able to walk out on the foreshore and collect any clams and crabs or shrimp or prawns or, other little vertebrates, eelgrass, sea pens, whatever is available out there. So it has a really important aspect to our life, but not only ecological as the obvious, but very cultural. There's a huge social component there as well, where we have long history of harvesting on that foreshore, and we're also known for our location, because we would have huge potlucks happening on our foreshores, and we had dozens and dozens of longhouses. So the social environment was a barter and trading environment at Tsawwassen First Nation, and it would be a core hub of communities coming together. So yeah, it does have a very special place. Tsawwassen First Nation has picked this place for thousands of years and continues to keep being in the center of most development opportunities as well. But I could go on for hours to talk about the importance of this location for us.
Mm-hmm. Great. And yeah, you touched upon some of the activities, in particular harvesting, that the community does. And I'm wondering what the Fraser Estuary means to you, or if you've conducted those, harvesting practices yourselves, or any of the kind of those crucial activities that you described to the community, with the community.
Yeah, thank you. It is actually the lifeline and the heartbeat of the Fraser River is the Lower Estuary. I personally have been taught even at a young age with a bucket and a stick to go harvest my own crab, and the importance of getting out there and looking for little bubbles in the sand. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the crab, and you would quickly be able to wedge your stick underneath the sand, and you could just kind of pop them up, and I'd be able to come home with a bucket full of them. So, it is very important to Tsawwassen First Nation that we start thinking about how we protect that foreshore, how we work with other organizations. Again, we're the salmon people facing the sea, so it's going to be a little hard to call yourself that if there's no salmon left. So it's kind of really important that we work together in identifying species at risk and how we mitigate future threats to that as well. So the estuary has vital importance to all species. You may not think it, but they're all kind of working synchronized with each other to feed everything that's coming in and going out of the estuary. So it's very important.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And then I'm wondering if you could give our participants like an idea of, do these activities that the community does, and you spoke upon them, like, digging up for crabs and other harvesting activities, do these activities vary among generations, for example, between elders and youth? And is there a strong ethic of learning or information and knowledge being passed down among generations for the youth to learn?
Yeah, good question. Over time, some of that knowledge has been lost, through a variety of different reasons. We know we don't need to belate what those reasons are. We're all quite aware of it through our history. But, at Tsawwassen First Nation, it's called revitalization, and we're revitalizing our culture wherever we can while using our elders as guidance and helping our youth get back out on the water. We used to have a huge fleet of boats and providers within our community that would go out and harvest. And, as harvesting starts to get very limited, the boats and capacity within our own membership starts to get a lot smaller. So identifying what those risks are and how we can try to move forward. Now we know that our providers and our harvesters need to work with our elders to get our youth back out on the water, and everybody is kind of in sync with each other again. So it is taking time, and it's going to take quite some time, but revitalization programs is definitely top of mind.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for those excellent answers. Riley, I'm going to switch over to you, and we'll kind of go back and forth here, just to so our participants can hear from both of you as we go along. I'm going to ask you a few questions about your research, and you mentioned in your introduction that your research looks at historical habitat that was available for salmon in the Lower Fraser, which has drastically changed after contact. And for those who live in the lower mainland of BC, have likely spent time in the area and seen that. For those who are tuning in from elsewhere, it might not be as familiar. So I'm wondering if you could give us kind of an overview of the historical context of salmon habitat in the Lower Fraser, really like what the Lower Fraser and estuary used to look like, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, it's a big question, and there's a lot to consider in all of that. With my work specifically, I've taken a focus to looking at the floodplain and how our flood infrastructure has alienated those floodplain habitats that can be used by salmon, particularly juveniles, for rearing. And then also looking at in-stream structures like culverts and floodgates that can alienate stretches of otherwise, could be useful stream habitat for rearing and spawning. And so I might just share my screen because I think there are a couple of interesting maps that kind of go towards illustrating that. So you can all see that.
Let's see. There we go.
Yeah, so this was really kind of the study area that I looked at to try and understand in-stream barriers. And so these data come from a lot of different sources. So a couple of provincial sources in the Fish Information Summary System, the Provincial Stream Crossing Inventory System maps culvert barriers. And then we have some great work that's been done by Watershed Watch Salmon Society to go out and map where flood infrastructure is impacting stream habitat accessibility. And so I brought these all together to show kind of the extent of where these barriers are impacting in-stream habitat connectivity. within the Lower Fraser. And I think it also sets kind of the Lower Fraser, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the area, into where it is in the world. So we can see that we're up here in British Columbia, in the southern portion of British Columbia, and then how those barriers are distributed throughout the region. And then we also looked at floodplain vegetation and mapping out dikes and how they alienate the floodplain. And to do this, we used a historical data set that was compiled by some researchers in the 70s that looked at mapping floodplain vegetation communities. And so from this map, we could pick out, what are those communities that are resilient to seasonal inundation. And we could assume that, at least on a seasonal basis, those areas could have been habitat for juvenile salmonids migrating down towards the ocean and towards the estuary. And so using these kind of two key data sets, along with information on where barriers are, we were able to get an idea of, the current extent of habitat alienation. And I have a few more maps, but maybe we'll get into more kind of specific aspects of that work. That's kind of like a broad overview of kind of what the idea for the study was, to use this available information to understand, how is this impacting the region as a whole, then also different specific populations of salmon.
Great. Yeah, that actually segues into my next question really well. So, your research looked at barriers to fish passage, and you briefly touched upon a lot of, this infrastructure is really flood control infrastructure. And I'm wondering, for the participants that are maybe less familiar with barriers to, infrastructure barriers, if you could describe the different types of barriers and how they vary in preventing fish passage. So, floodgates versus culverts or things like that.
Yeah. So when we're talking about in-stream barriers, probably the most common is the road culvert, or anywhere a road intersects with a smaller stream. Rather than building a bridge, it's often much cheaper to lay a metal pipe in and connect the stream that way. And depending on the length and the size of those culverts, that can create issues for migrating salmon, both upstream and downstream. So that would be the most common. Most of those points on the map that I showed would have been culverts that were reported to be causing issues for fish passage. And then also in the Lower Fraser, and very pervasive, are floodgates and pump stations that accompany those floodgates. And they work in tandem with the diking system that we looked at to assess floodplain connectivity. So in the Lower Fraser, seasonally, the water levels rise, and historically areas would have flooded where people now live. And so there's a diking infrastructure that prevents the Fraser from coming into those places. However, where the streams kind of meet those dikes, there's potential for back flooding up the creeks. And so these floodgates are meant to seasonally block that back flooding up these major tributaries. And so that means that the doors they often are a structure that have doors that can be closed and opened to allow the movement of water in and out. And so that's kind of, when I speak about floodgates, those are kind of the structures that can create those connectivity issues. And in the Lower Fraser, it's been reported by multiple studies, and Watershed Watch does a lot of great work monitoring those structures, that they often stay closed longer than they need to be, and that impacts the ability for salmon to move around and the quality of that habitat that sits upstream. And then it's also worth mentioning that there are a few kind of more major hydro reservoir dams in the Lower Fraser that also impact salmon. So the Coquitlam and Alouette dams were both responsible for causing extinctions of sockeye populations. And there's also the Ruskin Dam on the Lower Fraser, which alienates formerly accessible salmon habitat. So those are kind of the three main categories: are these flood infrastructure, looking at the dike system, how that alienates the floodplain, the floodgates, how it alienates the stream habitat, and then looking at culverts and hydro dams as well.
Great. I'm wondering if you could touch upon, and you're kind of alluding to that, about how these different types of infrastructure have left or resulted in, inaccessible salmon habitat, but also loss of a significant amount of salmon habitat. And I'm wondering if you can explain your work on lost streams.
Mm. Yeah, so one of the important things to remember when we look at a landscape, we might be, familiar with what it looks like, and that can become our baseline. And throughout our lives, that landscape might change, and our restoration aspirations might be to return it to, what it was like when we first saw it, um, or how it was, how we remember it. Um, but change happens over a long time. And so when we think about, the barriers that have been reported on streams, those are barriers that are reported on streams that still exist. And that's not the total extent of habitat that used to be here. There's some streams that have been removed completely. And so this work was kind of really started back in the 70s as well. So I'll just share an interesting map that I'm sure some people have seen. And it was work done by the aquarium, the Vancouver Aquarium, to map the lost streams of Vancouver. And so many of the streams here, in fact, pretty much all of them, are actually no longer existent in Vancouver. And they tried to map these streams by interviewing longtime residents of Vancouver to get their understanding of where the streams began, where they terminated, what kinds of fish were in them. And they were able to do a really good job of mapping, where these watercourses were that no longer exist. And so we were really interested in taking this and applying it to the entire Lower Fraser Valley area to understand the extent of loss, out beyond Vancouver's borders. And so to do that, we used a digital elevation model, which essentially is just a raster surface that shows the elevation. And from that, we can pull out where, so I actually have a diagram here I can show. We can get an idea of where streams would be on the landscape given the topography of that landscape. And then we can compare that, which is what this diagram shows, with currently mapped streams. So the blue ones are actually currently mapped. They still exist. And from that, we can get an idea of the difference and where those streams probably should be given the topography of the area, but are no longer extant. And so we were able to then take this methodology and apply it to the entire area. And so one of the outcomes was an extension of this Vancouver Lost Streams map as a first pass to try to identify those larger areas where streams have been lost and to get an idea of the extent of that loss. So we estimate about 1,700 kilometers of stream habitat that would be accessible to salmonids is no longer accessible. And so this is kind of a map showing how that kind of extrapolated out into the Lower Fraser Valley. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, it's really interesting to see all those streams that used to exist. And I think for a lot of people who maybe live in the Metro Vancouver area or have visited, when you go, in downtown Vancouver, you don't necessarily think that it used to be a geography or a landscape with lots of salmon-bearing streams. And it's really kind of eye-opening for people to realize that it used to be really important salmon habitat, but unfortunately they've kind of been lost due to urbanization and industrialization. And yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to switch back to Steve here. And Steve, I'm wondering, just kind of building off of what Riley has talked about and how much the landscape has changed. From your perspective, what are the threats facing the estuary today?
Well, thank you for that. Ryan did touch on some of it. It is the waterway, hydro damming, diverting of water, dams, and dredging. You also talked about industrialization. All of these things are major threats to the estuary. How we resolve that is still undetermined, but to this day, that's the question of the balance. How do we be able to balance out in a timely fashion of economics and still have the environment at top of mind? So, there's a lot of other factors. There's there's population, there's noise, noise in the water, there's overfishing, there's mismanagement, there's policy issues. It's a very, very complex question that would have been bogged down industries across the board with trying to answer that question and come up with a viable solution. So we all have our perspective, but I think we can all agree it is based upon economics is really what the issue on the lower estuary is. And it used to be the Fraser River was the biggest salmon population in the world. Right now we're dwindled down to a few 100,000 last year. It's quite sad to see. But I think we're on an upswing because people realize that we're looking at a mass extinction of a species here shortly if we don't correct it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And just building upon that further, we kind of outlined the threats. What, again, in your opinion, what is your vision of the Fraser River Estuary for the future? What kind of, I guess you could say in an ideal world, but what's your vision of the estuary for the future?
It would be nice to get it back to its glory days, whether that's achievable or not, or whether that's a fantasy land, but at least do a sustainable balance where you see life back into the estuary. Not that it's lifeless, but it is hurting, and it's trying to communicate with us on a multitude of different levels. Whether it's through environmental, whether it's through scientific, that Ryan does, and through cultural, and a lot of the information is handed down through generations of information. So, can we try to get some of that back? What is that threshold? So, ideally, I would like to see something for my grandkids. I'm a father of 4. My kids get to see the estuary in its current form. I've seen it evolve since I started roaming the land on the estuary, but if I could see it come back to life a little more for my grandkids, that would be nice when I have them. I'm not about to be a grandfather yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to ask this question to both of you, but I suspect that your answers will vary a little bit. But just, talking about a vision of the estuary for the future, if you could, wave a magic wand, what are 3 things that could be done both in the short term and the long term to kind of to realize this vision of what the estuary could look like for your grandkids in the future? Anything you can think of.
Well, I guess I would kind of
go.
Okay.
Yeah, I would reiterate what Stephen said about finding that balance. And so whether that means, flood infrastructure that protects people's homes, but also, recognizes the needs of the species that also call that place home.
Mm-hmm.
And so finding that balance between our infrastructural needs and the ecological needs of these important species. And that includes flood infrastructure, that includes, better practices around installing culverts or road crossings on streams, and then also restoring access or reenagramization of lost stocks in the Coquitlam and Alouette. Some of that work is already underway. So I think in terms of kind of the 3 major kinds of barriers that we see in the Lower Fraser, addressing those and finding balance in that way are I think really important to restoring connectivity.
Mm-hmm. Steve?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for that, Ryan. All great comments I'm hearing for sure. For me, I think it's about process. If it's the immediate effect right now is to slow down the process and make sure it's a little bit more thorough, to make sure that we have the scientific data to back up any further changes or development along the foreshore. And that's the immediate I would like to see. Long term, I think there needs to be a better governing system. And more inclusive opportunities to be involved for for municipal governments and Indigenous across the board. So I think true reconciliation starts with understanding individual nation needs and individual people on the water as well, and recognizing that the system actually isn't working. And yeah, it's a fantasy land that I live in, but it's also a political push that I'm definitely trying to push on a multitude of different fronts. And definitely would like to also long-term strategy is to see a like the SIGA society that we're starting, which is Salish Sea Indigenous Guardians Association, signed between Samiamu, Kwantlen, and Tawasin, to do a better review process and start what's called the cumulative effect baseline studies. So, we're looking to start projects or review projects before, during, and after their build out. So, these projects and these studies should be at least anywhere from 5 to 10 year studies, and they should be very consistent. So that way we could understand what the graft is and see if there's any changes. So, the big question today is cumulative effect and where to start, right? So myself and a few other leaders from other Indigenous communities are grabbing the bull by the horns, and that's a long-term strategy that will be starting here in the near future. In the next 4 or 5 months, we'll make an announcement on that new society in the media, and that'll be a long-term objective to working with Raincoast Forest and UBC and UVic and other organizations to help us with baseline study programs across the board for Indigenous communities around the Salish Sea.
Great. Yeah, I just have a follow-up question. With those cumulative effect studies and baseline studies, I guess it's kind of a two-part question. Is your intention to kind of have that data and information eventually feed into these very needed new governance regimes and plans, as you mentioned? And then that's the first part. And then the second part is over the long term, with the new society that you'll be announcing and have been developing, will there be a guardian aspect to it, or kind of like an ongoing stewardship aspect for the nations and community members to be involved in over the long term?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So the idea is to create a baseline hub of data information. As we all know, data proprietorship is usually held within colleges or environmental companies, but it's actually really hard for Indigenous communities to get a hold of that data. So the idea is to create a hub of information so that way we could be the holders of that data. We could share that data with other Indigenous communities, and we just keep building on the database so that way we can actually truly see the effects of different projects. And whether it's water sampling, crab studies, ooligans, estuary, vertebrates, ooligans, salmon. There's a multitude of different studies that we're currently already doing with different nations, but nobody's actually sharing that information with each other, right? So to create that society, go after federal and provincial fundings, but also ask industries to step up to the plate as well and contribute to this process as well, because it'll only help streamline their benefit as well by including and having a huge inclusion of Indigenous involvement. So that's what that is basically to do. And over time we are looking, we're not looking at a short-term goal. We're looking at 50 to 60 to 100-year society and continue to keep watching it grow. So we are in the infant stages of it, and right now it's a baby, and we're spoon feeding the idea, but we're getting a lot of support from governments at the current moment. Raincoast Forest is also helping support the idea as well, and so is the Salish Sea Initiative. So we are getting a lot of support on that aspect. And then I believe you had a second question there, and I don't know if I touched on it as well.
Yeah, and you did a bit, but it was just kind of about the longer term vision. And you said, like the society is for 50, 100 years to really try and rebuild these populations of fish and other species that used to be present in the Lower Fraser Estuary. But I'm wondering if there will be over the long term kind of a guardianship or stewardship component involved to either have community members conduct that baseline data, and with trainings and kind of like passing on the torch, if you will, and just have that more kind of involvement from the community over the longer term.
Yeah, and that is the focus of our society, is to be able to collect the funds from industries, governments, and municipal governments. But how do we enhance our opportunities for our youth and leadership programs while working hand in hand with nonprofit organizations? So yeah, the idea and the focus is to give our young leaders and people out on the water an opportunity, and not just water, on land as well, because the land is just as important as the water. They go hand in hand with each other, and you can't exclude either or of them. So there's a huge social and economic and cultural component to exactly what we're doing here. Is the society then will help create a program, territories that, and then allow the nations to use their own capacity within their membership to conduct those studies, with going hand in hand with people like Ryan and other scientific experts, because we can't just do it on our own. We need scientific experts to be a part of these projects to validate the scientific data behind it. And over time, it turns into a guardian program, and it is a guardian program. It's watching over land and the sea, and going hand in hand with, while still collecting that data and just keep feeding the baseline study. Cumulative effect, nobody even knows what that means, right? It's just it's a complicated word that everybody keeps talking about these days, but somebody needs to grab the bull by the horns, and whether it's like I said, small studies that last multi years, again, before a project even starts, during the project build out, and then after the project build out, because you may not see species show up prior to, you may see them show up during, and because of the alteration of the landscape, you now all of a sudden had species that you wouldn't have seen. So what was the change, and how did it change, and what were the components? What is the environmental mitigation risks, and also what are the enhancements? So if we could start to give proponents a clear indication of what methods we'd like to see populations grow, what we know from scientific data of other people using, we could interject that. And then, First Nations also can use that data to collectively make up their own decision. The society by no means determines if a project gets to go through or not. That's not what we're here for. We are only here to help with data collection and provide scientific information only.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for describing the new society to us. It sounds really exciting, and it sounds like there's lots of potential, and its collaboration is really integral to it happening. And just like all of our work, I mean, we collaborate with so many different people, and it really takes everyone involved to progress. So that's really cool. Thanks for describing that. Riley, I'm just going to go back to you now just to ask a couple more questions about your research. So we talked about barriers, we talked about how they prevent fish from passing through them, the different types of barriers, and the streams that used to exist in Metro Vancouver, and how you applied that methodology to the Fraser Valley and Lower Fraser River. And I'm wondering if you could just touch upon the results you found about how much habitat has actually been lost and what that means for different salmon populations. And even if you could touch upon how like their life cycles are so interrelated with their salmon, their habitat, and how those barriers affect that and the loss of habitat.
Yeah, so I mean, depending on how familiar people are with salmon, it should be highlighted that in the Lower Fraser, we have kind of the five, I looked at the five kind of major species of Pacific salmon, that includes chum, sockeye, coho, pink salmon, and then Chinook. And so we looked at kind of these, and within those species, we have kind at the federal level, they're managed under conservation units, and these conservation units kind of determined to return to the same natal streams or watersheds that in which they were kind of originally born and reared and then migrated out. And so we can use kind of that dependence that these different populations and species have on those watersheds to understand the different effects of barriers on them. And so kind of one of the interesting results, I might just share my screen again here, was that it varied quite a bit across the different populations that we looked at. Kind of depending on whether we're looking at stream habitat or floodplain. And you can see that lost streams for a certain number of species plays a big role in the total amount of alienated habitat across these populations. We've also quantified channelized streams because, you know, as Stephen has brought up, you know, the barriers aren't the only thing that are impacting salmon when it comes to, you know, their freshwater habitat. And so understanding how when a stream is straightened and essentially turned into a ditch, how that degrades the quality of that habitat for salmon. And so we can see that one of the interesting results is many of the populations that have remained unassessed by COSEWIC, which is our kind of federal, well, I guess it's an arm's length assessment, science-based science organization to assess the status and recommend these populations for whether they should be listed as endangered, threatened, special concern, not at risk. Many of the populations that remain unassessed are impacted the most by these barriers. And so it could be important to take a deeper look at, well, how are these populations doing? How do barriers impact them specifically in terms of their life history? Are they limited in spawning or rearing habitat? And then what additional threats do they face? And so, yeah, it varies quite a lot when we think about, you know, the stream habitat accessibility across populations, but floodplain and thinking about how the Lower Fraser has largely been kind of protected because it's where people live by the diking system. We can see that a lot of the habitat has been alienated based on that historical vegetation data that we used to quantify that. And so we can see that, you know, across the region, approximately 64% of stream habitat has been alienated and about 85% of the floodplain habitat on average. But yeah, it varies quite a lot depending on the population that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm going to ask two follow-up questions, but before, I think we lost Riley. Oh no. Hopefully he'll join back in a second. But while we're waiting for Riley to join again, I'll just remind our participants that feel free to enter any questions that you have. I see that people have been joining us from all over the world, which is pretty amazing, down in the States as well as the Netherlands, all around BC and Canada. So it's really great to see that so many people are joining us from so many different places. Oh, and there's Riley.
Oh, I dropped out there. I got confused with my tabs.
That's okay. I was just reminding our participants that we'll have about 10 minutes here coming up to answer the questions that they may have. So feel free to enter them in the chat box. And before we get to those questions, Riley, I just have a couple of follow-up questions for you. So you just shared with us the amount of habitat that's been lost, and it's quite a lot of habitat. And so looking towards the future and how this data and your research can be used for restoration decision-making or listing certain salmon populations as at risk or et cetera under the Species at Risk Act, are barrier removal projects a successful restoration option? And has that been done in the Lower Fraser before?
Yeah, and I guess the short answer is that it would depend. Especially, you know, I want to bring up the cumulative effects idea again. With the extent of habitat degradation in the Lower Fraser, removing a barrier to a channelized stream might not actually benefit a salmon population that much if it can't make use of that habitat. And so when it comes to prioritizing, which barriers make the most sense to remove to get that immediate benefit, you're going to be looking for that kind of low-hanging fruit, a culvert that's kind of blocking off potentially productive habitat. And then in the longer term, we need to be thinking about, what policy changes, what additional restoration actions do we need to take to improve the quality of that degraded habitat, such that removing those barriers would have the effect that it's intended. And then it also somewhat depends on the population of salmon that we're looking at and aiming to restore. So out in the Fraser Canyon, barriers, as reported that we know of, don't seem to really cut off that much habitat, particularly for, say, Fraser Canyon Chinook. However, in Boundary Bay, those are some of the most impacted salmon populations. And so removing that barrier, keeping in mind the additional threats to those populations, could really help to help those numbers.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Just one more question here, and then we'll move on to our participant questions. So you work with Dr. Tara Martin in the Conservation Decisions Lab, and I'm wondering if you could speak to how your research on barriers and how it's affected salmon habitat can tie into her research on priority threat management. Some of our viewers might not be familiar with PTM, so if you could give a quick overview of how it's a decision-making tool for conservation, and then kind of tie into your research into that policy change.
Yeah, it really does feed in quite nicely, because if we think about barrier removal as an action for restoring salmon, we have these kind of interspecies and location dependent potential benefits that we get from restoring different barriers. And so what priority threat management is really about, and this is work led by Tara and a PhD student, Leah Chalafor, who I believe will be on a webinar similar to this next week or in the coming weeks, is really about kind of taking a higher level approach and thinking about, well, if barrier removal is one action, what are all of the potential actions we could do to save salmon? And which ones should we invest in such that we maximize, the money that we invest in those actions to save the most amount of conservation units or populations of salmon. And so from that, we kind of get a better idea of how to, manage those cumulative effects, and to what extent and for what populations a specific action like barrier removal could actually have that benefit. And so, some of kind of the next steps of this is to look more systematically at site-based locations of where these barriers are and identify, those locations for the actual removal and restoration of those barriers. Whereas kind of the priority threat management kind of looks at which actions to take. From this work, you can kind of get more specific. Where do you take that action?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like it feeds in nicely, really well. Use the data that you've gathered and found in your analyses to help inform these kind of broader, bigger picture decision making. It's exciting. Thanks for providing your overview and description of your research. It's been really informative. In the last 10 minutes or so here, I'm going to just address some of the participant questions. So we have one for Steve, actually, and I'm going to put it up on that one. It's by Christine. So she says she's a social scientist and is about to start a new project, and wondering if Stephen could speak to whether there's a need for gathering or sharing of qualitative data and/or stories.
Well, there's always opportunities to share the data and information. I guess it depends on the sensitivity of what we're looking for. But for the broader scope of different projects, I think it's always nice to work collaboratively hand in hand with each other to share any information. So, you know, for the society and our work, we're looking to start quick wins is what we talked about before, and finding some success stories in some of the projects that have already undertaken, whether it's a salmon study, crab study, hooligans, and just kind of expand on that and keep long-term projects going. So yeah, data sharing is always good, but coming into communities, there's always there's a process to you know, coming down to talk with our elders, our youth, and you know, Indigenous communities are very sensitive about who can come down at what time. Obviously during COVID time, but prior to COVID, it too is still a bit of a process. So there's a long-standing history of distrust with different Indigenous communities for good reason. So, you know, breaking through those relationships and opening up the door just a little bit, and allowing people to come down and gather the knowledge that they need to keep their projects informative information for cultural purposes, for sure.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Oh, Christine actually has a clarifying point here. She says, if your let's see, if your organization could make use of this kind of work. So I think she's saying, asking if your society could make use of this kind of work of needing or sharing and gathering and sharing qualitative data and stories. But I think you did a pretty good job of addressing that. So maybe, Christine, if you have any more follow-up or clarifying questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box and we can address that further. But I see here there's a question for Riley, so I'm going to put that on the screen here. It's from Betty. Betty says, Riley, very interesting work. Thanks for sharing. I'm curious what your approach is to prioritizing barrier removal in the Lower Fraser.
Yeah, that's a great question. So with collaboration with my supervisor, Tara Martin, we're using a mathematical optimization approach. And so what it does is it relates all these barriers on the network and where they are in relation to each other. And we can measure how much habitat we expect to gain from the removal of a barrier, and we can get indicators of the quality of that habitat. And then from that, you can optimize the removal given a certain budget for how much resources you have available for doing that restoration, with cost estimates at each location. And so this is kind of a technique that's used in the scientific literature a lot, and we're trying to make it more useful in an applied setting. And so we're using software that has been used for conservation planning in the past to make it essentially more accessible for anyone who is interested in kind of asking that question to, you know, quantify their own metrics, whether it be habitat amount of a given species specifically, or you're interested in you know, barriers when we remove them that we expect we won't need to do additional restoration, to make the applied value essentially of these optimization approaches more applicable for actually influencing decisions or informing decisions around where we remove barriers. And so it's really more about developing this tool to help people make their own decisions and to give people information, rather than creating a single prioritization that sets out the priorities for the region, because we just know there's, you know, diverse interests and different people have different interests in restoring different features. And so how do you make these techniques that make the best of the information that we have to inform, you know, where we might take out these barriers?
Great. Thanks, Riley, and thanks, Betty, for the great question. Just in our last couple of minutes here, I have a couple more questions for Steve, actually, and then we'll kind of outline what our next episode looks like. So quickly, Steve, how can people continue to engage or educate themselves on the importance of the Lower Fraser River and estuary, particularly to the Tsawwassen Nation people or other Indigenous nations in the region?
Well, information is key. As we all know, informing yourself and getting out there and understanding what's actually happening. For myself, I could only use my own experiences being out on the water and understanding the landscape for the 25 years since I've been fishing and crabbing, that it has dramatically changed for a negative purpose. So, you know, I've gotten out there and involved myself in a multitude of different studies over the years. I went to university, re-educated myself, upgraded my boats, injected myself to working with almost every environmental group out there on different types of projects and scopes of work, and while bringing Indigenous inclusion all the way. So for me, it's about making sure that there's a watchful eye. I don't actually get the data, but yet I'm a part of the project. I do understand it, and glad that somebody is a part of it, but now I'm able to share that. So sharing knowledge with each other has to be a key as well. And, you know, Ryan talked about quantifying the knowledge, and that data has to be quantified by the society as well. So just to quickly go back to the other lady's question, yes, we're interested in data, but that data needs to be quantified by Indigenous-led group, right? So, you know, while we appreciate organization wanting to give us their data, that's not Indigenous-led opportunities. So we need to get out there, do the studies ourselves, and watch the data come in. And that's how we quantify the society's information.
Yep, absolutely. And so just last question here. If for the participants watching, what are kind of the 3 most important things about the estuary to you personally that you want them to walk away with knowing forever?
Well, if the lower estuary doesn't change, you know, it's gonna be hard for Coast Salish people to recover from that. You know, there's so many questions and answers I can give there, but you know, there's a huge social and cultural component here. I can't definitively give you a clear direction as to what I think participants should take away, but you know, other that the ecological sensitivity of things Ryan talked about and the things you're talking about, all of it really goes hand in hand with each other. So any component of the lower estuary is affected has a unintended consequence to another area as well. So just keeping in mind that every time we step out there, we do things and we're not mindful about where we're going there, it has an unintended consequence somewhere else.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much for your wise words. So just in the last minute or so here, I am going to just outline briefly about our next episode, which is in 2 weeks from now. So our next episode is March 31st at 12 p.m. again, Pacific time. And it will feature 2 scientists who are learning about the importance of the estuary to juvenile salmon specifically, as well as insights into how we can restore habitat connectivity within the Fraser Estuary. And again, our webinar is really focused on this theme of connectivity and how it connects people, salmon, whales, and birds across 2 hemispheres. So we'll continue to touch upon that theme in the future episodes. And we will send out more information on the next episodes. If you have any questions about the webinar or the episode in general, my email is on the screen, so feel free to email me. It's kristen@raincoast.org. Alternatively, you can visit our webpage, which has all of the information on the webinar, as well as information on the specific episodes. So with that, I would like to thank Stephen Riley. Thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. On behalf of Raincoast, we really appreciate you both coming to share your knowledge and your stories about the Lower Fraser River and the estuary and why it's important to you. So thank you so much. And thanks for all of the participants for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We hope you've learned something, and we hope that you will join us again in 2 weeks. So until the next episode. Thanks again. Bye.
Thanks.